Hello, folks. We're down the line from Cape Cod once again tonight with political analyst, author, and historian Dr. James D. Boys. I'm Michael L. Roberts. This is the American Chronicle. We do warmly welcome you to this, the 21st episode of the American Chronicle. My apologies for the somewhat garish backdrop behind me here, compared by Dr. James D. Boys as being akin to something from a Hobbit movie. So, Peter Jackson, if you're listening, myself and apparently this hotel room are available should you wish to reinvigorate the franchise. Tonight's show follows hot on the heels of the final presidential debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. This was the 16th time that we have seen Donald Trump debate in this setting, and indeed the 16th and last time, given the 4 years ahead being either his final term or the first term of a President Biden. As such, I began by asking James for his initial impressions of last night's debate.
So last night we saw the second and final debate between President Trump and Vice President Joe Biden. It was a debate which many people, myself included, had speculated might not actually occur. Indeed, over here in the United States, as late as an hour or two beforehand, many of the networks were asking whether it was actually going to occur due to the regulations which had been imposed on the candidates, which many of us believed that Donald Trump might well not want to adhere to. However, it went ahead, and under slightly unusual circumstances, obviously because of the COVID situation. And clearly, it was a very different debate than the previous debate, which, of course, many people were still reeling from, quite frankly. But you would have to say, I think, that Donald Trump seems to have learnt from that occasion and gave a debate which was totally removed from his first debate, much more controlled, possessed, and dignified, which isn't necessarily aren't three adjectives which one would usually apply to Donald Trump.
Yes, unusual decorum. To what extent do you associate that with the setting of the rules, and to what extent do you associate it with campaign strategy, as it were?
Well, very clearly the rules are changed on this occasion to ensure that the candidates both knew that they were going to be muted at the end of their first 2-minute statement. It's doesn't look as though that muting actually needed to be utilized. It looked as though the candidates, and particularly Donald Trump, realized that their mics were going to be cut. So why bother, trying to fight the system? You have to say, I think, to give credit to both the Commission for Presidential Debates, the two candidates, and indeed the moderator, who is getting great praise over here for her work on the night, that the rules seem to work splendidly. Very clearly, they hadn't been in effect on the previous debate, and that was, quite frankly, a car crash, which was an embarrassment to all concerned. Last night, I think even the president's most harshest critics, I would hope, would have to give him some credit for turning in a performance which was as stately, presidential, controlled as, frankly, I've ever seen Donald Trump. And one would imagine that performance will have done well for him amongst independent voters, at the very least.
I've seen the statistics on the number of falsehoods that were presented by both candidates in this case. To what extent do you feel that the presentation in this instance, that different Trump in presentation mode, in a softer, more relaxed, less interrupting mode, covered himself a little bit in terms of the fact that fundamentally many of the things he was saying were still the same old falsehoods that he has previously shouted at the cameras and his opponents.
Well, who'd have thought we'd see a kinder, gentler Trump, quite frankly. However, miracles can happen, I guess. I think that the important thing to take away from this is that the networks are very, very eager to try and fact check this. And I know CNN had a fact checker running throughout the night. Very clearly that there were falsehoods, missteps on both parts, on the hearts of both candidates, quite frankly. And I'm quite sure that there were more coming from Donald Trump. But to the average voter, I think, and individual who's watching this, I don't think most people are sitting there with a scoreboard trying to, go through this with a fine tooth comb to discern whether one candidate or another's figures are factually correct or not. I remember, 20 odd years ago, George W. Bush suggesting that we were going to hear some fuzzy math from Al Gore, if you remember that occasion. So these debates are entirely about presentation. Tone, presentation is vital. The actual factual makeup, I'm sorry to say, probably has less import than many people, political scientists in particular, would like to think. This is about presentation. It's a visual medium that we're looking at here. We're not in 1960, where a high percentage of the population are listening to this on the radio and thinking, well, I think Nixon won because they couldn't see his 5 o'clock shadow, effectively. This is a visual medium now, and how it is that the two candidates present themselves has probably more importance than what they convey. And I think on that basis, if not that basis alone, you'd have to say Donald Trump had a great night. How he comported himself, how he presented himself. Just from a physical standpoint, he's a much bigger man than Joe Biden. Biden, I had to say, looked an awful lot more than just 3 years older than Donald Trump did last night. And I thought that as the performance waned throughout the evening, Joe Biden's confidence seemed to dissipate. I thought that President Trump, you would never have thought he was only in the hospital some 7 to 10 days ago. He looked a very like a man in charge of himself and at ease with himself, I thought. Whereas Joe Biden just looked like a 77 frail old man. And the longer the debate went on, it seemed the more flustered he got, the more he got caught up in himself. And of course, at the end of the debate, he talked about trying to transition away from big oil, which he's since had to try to walk back. So presentationally, I thought it was a good night for the president, and it'll be interesting to see how that is reflected not only in the immediate polls which come out, but also, of course, for those people who are yet to vote in the November election.
A light question followed by a detailed question here. Did I catch a Biden looking at his watch? And I know that you can give us some historical context on that, on the light front, and on the energy front in terms of what would be happening under a Biden administration in terms of the oil industry. I haven't seen the walkbacks today. Could you fill me in on that, please?
Yeah, so about 2/3 of the way through the debate, Joe Biden inexplicably started looking at his watch. For those students of American history, which I know include yourself and myself, it immediately should trigger memories of 1992, when President George H.W. Bush, in the town hall setting meeting with Governor Clinton and Ross Perot, infamously did exactly the same thing, checking his watch. Now, President Bush said thereafter, well, I was doing it because I was trying to see how much extra time the other candidates were talking after their allotted time. The problem is, of course, that, again, see my previous answer, it's a visual medium, and people aren't sitting there, trying to analyze what George H.W. Bush is thinking or read tea leaves about why he might be doing something. All they know is, oh, here's a guy looking at his watch. He looks bored. Does he want to be here? That was the message which came out of that. It was compounded by a relatively poor performance that night. And of course, George H.W. Bush went on to lose that election to Bill Clinton. Last night, obviously Joe Biden was seen checking his watch. Just here's a message to anybody doing debates. If you're doing a debate, take your watch off before you go on stage. You don't need it. It serves you no purpose. It can only be a distraction. So again, but it speaks, I think, to the one of the challenges which comes out of these debates is that you take from it what you bring to it. So the networks here have been, as usual, very, very partisan. Fox News basically saying how well Donald Trump has done, how poorly Joe Biden's done. CNN and MSNBC giving Donald Trump absolutely no credit for his more presidential performance, if you will. Jake Tapper almost immediately suggesting, well, people seem to think he wants plaudits because he didn't set himself on fire. It's like, well, that gets us nowhere, quite frankly. So no one's critiquing Biden for looking at his watch yet. We'll see. One wonders. Let's see what happens. We're speaking now the day after the final debate. If Biden loses his presidential election, let's see whether, in the aftermath of that defeat, people look back on the autopsy of his campaign and say, well, look, he checked his watch. It was a turning point for the campaign. People thought he looked bored, tired, etc., just like they did with H.W. Bush in 1992. Something that he certainly did at the end, almost the right at the end. I mean, again, I talked about Biden's energy levels dropping. He made, I think, what was perhaps the biggest gaffe of the night, which was talking about making the transition away from big oil. Well, to many people on the political left, and certainly in Europe, I'm sure, that will be a blessing to their ears, people who want to move away from fossil fuels towards, electric cars, etc. But the oil industry in this country is huge and very, very difficult to underestimate how important it is on all kinds of levels, politically, financially, culturally, socially. And Donald Trump pulled him on it. I mean, he immediately realized what it was that Biden had done. Let's be honest about it. Look, the difficulty with this is as soon as you try to suggest that Donald Trump did something right, there's people out there who want to say, oh, you're an apologist for Donald Trump, and I knew it all along, and you should have a brown shirt on, not a blue shirt. The problem is that Donald Trump is a better candidate to a certain extent than he was 4 years ago on some issues and yet not on others. I thought the debate performance last night was the best debate performance I have ever seen him give, going all the way back through the Republican primaries, the debates with Hillary, and right up until the last debate with Joe Biden, which was a real terrible incident. Last night, he was great. And frankly, if he had acted like that from day one of his presidency, I think he'd be in a very different place now with the polls and with the American people. But he hasn't been. Donald Trump clocked the fact that at the first debate, Joe Biden had started to distance himself from the Green New Deal and said, look, you just lost the left, which is probably true, quite frankly. If Biden wants to win the election, he needs to basically not only reach into the middle and get independents and disaffected Republicans if he can do so, but make sure he brings the left with him. If he can't do all that, he can't win the presidency. And last night it was telling that Donald Trump immediately jumped all over the fact that Biden had talked about transitioning away from big oil. There's no doubt, I think, that in the long run, that's probably a necessity of life. But as Trump reminded him, the United States is now energy independent for the first time in forever, quite frankly. And one of the reasons for that is because of, domestic oil production, as well as other assets of the American energy market, quite frankly. So when Biden starts talking about moving away from big oil, that immediately puts all the gains that the Democrats are trying to make in places like Texas, for example, at risk. And it's notable, I think, that there's been a discernible attempt to try and walk that back somewhat. But people will, of course, remember the statement and not the retraction, I think.
What does it tell us about the political cycle of 4 years that a candidate in this position at this time with regards to climate crises, climate change, global warming and otherwise can't set or can't be seen to set that trajectory because of the way it impacts upon the present as opposed to how it might impact upon the future.
So this is one of the great challenges with the American electoral system. There are advantages and disadvantages to it. The American Constitution was set up so that there was not a constitutional monarch. They didn't want to replace, the English monarch with an American monarch. So what do you do? Well, you therefore have relatively short time frames for every administration. Now, we're talking about a document which has been in place for over 240 years. So back in the day, of course, a 4-year term was not necessarily a short time period, and people didn't have as long a life expectancy as they do nowadays. But one of the challenges you have is that when the most a president can serve, except under very unusual circumstances, is for 8 years. That really is not a long time to implement change of any sort, quite frankly. It really is a problem when you are running for election, trying to understand how to be in a position, be that the president, the Senate, or the House, and then of course you're immediately looking to re-election, and then once you're re-elected, you're almost a lame duck, and people are looking to your successor. So trying to establish long-term policy, whether that's domestic policy with regard to energy, whether it's foreign and looking at sort of grand strategy issues, it becomes very, very difficult simply because of the electoral timescales which the Constitution imposes upon every American politician, be they Republican or Democrat. And of course, when you compound that with the need to try to win certain demographics within the United States, certain key states within the Union, if you are to secure an electoral college mandate, then that all of a sudden becomes more and more complicated. We've seen how these issues can play out. One of the challenges, for example, why relationships with Cuba, for example, have remained so static over the years, and why Donald Trump was so eager to roll back Barack Obama's progress in the areas, it comes down to one word, and that is Florida. Candidates need the electoral college votes from Florida to win the presidency. And we saw 4 years ago, if Florida had gone Hillary Clinton's way, which many of us thought it possibly could have done and should have done, she'd be president of the United States now. It didn't. And I'm sure that part of the reason for that was Donald Trump making very, very clear to Floridians that he wasn't in favor of what Obama, and by extension, Obama's Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, had done with regard to normalizing relations with Cuba. So, this idea of the foreign impacting the domestic and the domestic impacting the foreign is something which, has been at the center of a lot of my work over the years, but which is all too often, I think, forgotten by the American media in particular, and by analysts who simply want to focus upon either foreign policy or domestic policy. But here in an election cycle, I think you can see very much how they do impact one another. And certainly with regard to the energy industry, that was the focus of your question, very clearly the energy sector that Joe Biden's remarks last night might appear to impact are key states within the union, which, it must be said, Democrats are looking to try to make great strides in. Frankly, if the Democrats could start flipping Texas, Republicans would be out of the White House for a very long time period. So that's why Joe Biden's apparent gaffe last night was so important.
In terms of, as you say, of transcending that duality of a perceived duality of domestic and foreign policy, would you say the better campaign strategy in these presidential campaign moments would be to keep your cards close to your chest, as it were, in terms of long-term strategy, long-term trajectory, and attempt to capture the zeitgeist rather than the future?
I think an election cycle is always a bad time for forecasting and for projection. Very clearly, the American presidency in the past has on occasion been the place of great aspiration and goal setting. None more so, of course, in the early 1960s when President Kennedy pledged to put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. There's been one or two presidents who were able to make that kind of aspirational dream setting, if you will. But elections are a bad time for that because, of course, most people probably don't believe promises made in an election year. But what is notable, I think, about Donald Trump this time round is the lack of goal setting for a second term. He doesn't seem to have a rationale for why he would want to be president for another 4 years, other than to stop Joe Biden from becoming president. Well, that's one reason, I suppose, but it's not exactly a reason to rush out to vote for someone. But likewise, it must be said, what's Joe Biden's aspiration? Well, it's to stop Donald Trump continuing to be president. The lack of aspirational qualities in these two men is remarkable, quite frankly. For those of us who grew up, under Reagan's America and with the distant, not too distant memory of Kennedy's America, this I think augurs poorly for the United States in terms of its future. Both men, of course, are in their, let's be generous, mid-70s. And, one wonders how much longer they will be around. There is a natural life expectancy after all. Whoever wins the election in November, the very first question will be asked, well, who comes next? What happens next? Because, of course, Donald Trump is constitutionally prohibited from seeking a third term in office. So the question will be, who starts the race to replace him? What's Mike Pence doing? Is he positioning himself? If Joe Biden has been elected, he will be America's oldest elected president at 77, if I'm not mistaken. And all the questions will be now about, well, what's his health like? What's going to be happening? Where's Kamala Harris? What's she positioning herself? This is one of the reasons this election is so bizarre is, yes, there are key issues at stake, but whoever wins is in many ways going to be a placeholder president for the next president. And that, again, you were asking me earlier on about the timescales of the American presidential system. Again, this is one of the great flaws in this system, which is as soon as one president is elected, the race to replace them begins in earnest, meaning that the focus is always upon the next election and not upon the next governing cycle, which is one of the reasons I've always said this system is geared up beautifully for campaigning, but poorly for governing.
Yeah. Campaign in poetry and govern in prose. Yes.
Absolutely.
The picking up on the importance of presentation and as you rightfully say, this notion that the campaigns aren't the great space for trajectory. What would the undecided voter in America last night have got from what they felt Trump was going to do with America for 4 years and what Joe Biden was going to do with America for 4 years?
Well, I think that one of the things that they will be asking themselves, perhaps, is a question which Donald Trump raised, which is when Joe Biden was expressing what he wanted to do. A lot of it seemed to be either continuing the work of Barack Obama to some extent or correcting fixes, which either he himself had been involved in as vice president or during his former career as a senator. And as Donald Trump kind of rightly said, well, what were you doing for 8 years when you were vice president? Why weren't you doing this when you were in office? Why wait, another, another 4 years to run and then, talk about something you might do if you're elected. So I thought that was an effective line from Donald Trump last night. Biden obviously is talking about correcting and continuing what was originally known as Obamacare, which he now suggests would become Biden Care. Interestingly, quite happy to put his own name to a system which many people believe has many flaws to it, quite frankly. That compares very starkly with Donald Trump, who didn't say it last night, but certainly revealed in the 60 Minutes tape that his campaign leaked that he'd be very happy if the Supreme Court struck it down and got rid of it. So there are stark contrasts with regard to that policy. With regard to other policies, it depends what you want to believe. Clearly, Biden said last night that he was talking about transitioning away from big oil. Maybe that is the case, maybe it isn't the case, depending upon what he said today, quite frankly. Very clearly, Donald Trump doesn't believe that. He's all for American continued energy independence and for making America secure at home from an energy point of view, which many people, I think, here would be in favor of. Issues of taxation clearly come up. it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that Donald Trump, as a Republican president, would want to continue with a low taxation threshold and reducing taxes upon Americans, whereas the Democrats have long had a history of raising taxes. And frankly, little that Joe Biden has ever said would probably convince people otherwise. So, if people are voting out of their own self-interest on those issues, then probably Joe Biden has a mountain to climb. On the other hand, there's a small matter of coronavirus and the fact that we've now passed, I think it's 220,000 deaths here in the United States. Under the best line Joe Biden had all night, quite frankly, came at the top of the debate when he said quite clearly that anyone responsible for the deaths of 220,000 Americans doesn't deserve to be president of the United States. Now that's a killer line, quite frankly. The question is, which will stick? We are, I believe, at a point now where more people have already voted this electoral cycle by mail-in ballots than voted in the entirety of the election some 4 years ago. Now that's remarkable. It says a lot about the dip in voter turnout 4 years ago, which I will always believe will be one of the main reasons that Hillary lost in those three key states.
A bigger reflection on then than now, perhaps.
Yeah, indeed. So what does that mean? Does that mean who is left to vote, quite frankly? How many people will be left to be influenced after last night's debate? Is it true that Joe Biden could have basically had a terrible night and it not impacted? Is it true that the president could have had the best debate performance of his life, and yet it still wouldn't be enough because the vast majority of people who are going to vote will have voted? Who knows? It's going to be fascinating to see how it is that the ultimate tally of votes comes out in terms of how many people will put mail-in ballots compared to people turning up on the to vote on election day itself.
Out of interest, what sort of percentage of the American electorate does that? Those who have already voted, what sort of percentage does that take up?
It depends very much upon how it is you calculate the American electorate, quite frankly. But clearly, the suggestion would be that at this point, anything up to some 50% of Americans who are eligible to vote may well have done so by mail-in ballots. Well, when you consider that, trying to get more than 50% of Americans to vote, quite frankly, in an election is like pulling teeth. Then you realize just how many people have gone to the polls very, very early. A great turnout might be 60%. Very, very clearly, we're now at a point where that might well be achieved at this rate prior to the election itself. I believe that we've cleared some 55% of Americans who are eligible to vote having done so. When you consider that the turnout dropped 4 years ago, and the idea now that perhaps even more people than that have voted by mail-in, it does make you realize what a shift we're seeing here in participatory democracy. I should point out, by the way, I saw an interesting story before we came on to do this, suggesting that Donald Trump is planning to vote by mail-in ballot this weekend, which made me smile because, of course, he spent so much time attacking the process and suggesting that it was a system that was wide open to fraud and abuse.
You mean he won't be queuing in person?
Apparently not. Apparently not.
Incredible.
Yes.
Speaking of in person and at person, as it were, it was fairly noteworthy last night that whilst occasionally through a lens of greater decorum, Donald Trump continued his ad hominem attacks upon Joe Biden and Joe Biden's family. Nearly every time, other than a few corrections, Biden shied away from, would you like to respond to that, which felt very much like a charged question of, would you like to respond to that with an ad hominem attack back? Did Biden make a mistake in not going after the Trump family in the same way that Trump went after the Biden family in the final debate?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? How do you respond to attacks of that nature? Do you do it by simply trying to deny it and moving on, or do you basically, from a critical point of view, descend to the same level? The challenge, of course, is this. If you actually analyze Joe Biden's responses to attacks that his family members have benefited financially from his position as a public servant, there is a slight challenge, which is Joe Biden's responses tend to be, I've never benefited from any financial gain. I've never received money. Well, that's not the allegation. The allegation isn't have you benefited, it's have your family, has your siblings, have your offspring benefited. And he seems to be either unwilling or unable to address that question. And the problem is that, it's a little bit like when Bill Clinton was initially asked by Jim Lehrer about the relationship with Monica Lewinsky, when he was first asked questions about his alleged relationship with Jennifer Flowers. And his answer is always, there isn't a relationship. But the answer there wasn't a relationship. And, people initially don't clock that. But once you start to see that pattern emerging, then you realize that there's an effort here to pass your answer, and you can't give a straight answer. If Joe Biden had said at any point, look, I've not benefited financially from any of this. Clearly my children or my siblings are their own individuals, and they have gone out into the world and made their own way in the world and have benefited from these relationships, just as your own children have, Mr. President. I noticed that Ivanka is making X number of million. I noticed that Don Jr. is continuing to make deals like this. There is the old expression that people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. And it's remarkable to me that someone who lives in a White House, rather than a glass house, is throwing stones of this nature, because you would have thought it would be an all too obvious point for Joe Biden to come back and to critique how it is that Donald Trump has run his business empire, the roles that are played by Don Jr. And Eric Trump and Ivanka Trump and by extension, Jared Kushner. And yet he's not done so. Whether you see that as reaching for the high ground in an honorable way is one thing. It could also be a catastrophic mistake, because it does allow the charges to rest, arguably unanswered, without revealing what might be thought of as the hypocrisy, quite frankly, in Donald Trump's decision to go after Joe Biden in this fashion.
I'll try, for the purposes of gaining a historical context answer out of you, to tie two of tonight's themes together. The one is that electoral four-year cycle and the limitations that it places upon how things might be communicated. And the other one is what I understand to be some of the more moderate Republicans' argument that within a sense, the term global warming doesn't actually incorporate global very much. It's global warming policies in terms of the Green New Deal stateside that ensure that whilst America is required and the West is required to deplete its efforts in raw material, energy and otherwise, the India, Russia, China, etc. are burning through raw materials at an unprecedented rate, essentially engaging in their own industrial revolution in the 21st century. So tying those two things together, how do you see this notion that the Western four-year electoral cycle limits the grand strategy of a leader within that situation in a way that it does not limit Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, or otherwise?
Yeah, so last night we saw, the limitations of the American electoral system at the fore, quite frankly, because one of the difficulties is that from an outside point of view, especially from Europe, it's very easy, I think, to mock successive Republican American presidents for refusing to engage positively with the global effort to combat climate change. We saw this several years ago with George W. Bush, for example, when he refused to join the Kyoto Protocol. We've seen it starkly with Donald Trump and his withdrawal from the Paris climate control agreement. That was on display last night because, of course, Joe Biden said that he would re-engage with that. And I'm sure from a European point of view, one wonders why there is that distinction between the two parties. I think one of the challenges is, and Donald Trump laid this out, is that certainly from a Republican point of view, it's believed that the United States is surrendering its position in the present to allow for the future development of potential global competitors, such as China, Russia, India, even, for whom the Republican Party would say we are laying off jobs, we are dismantling our own energy infrastructure for no discernible benefit except for the benefit of India, China, Russia. And when you see how it is that people like Vladimir Putin, for example, have positioned themselves so that, sure, they're in a democracy and are running for re-election, Putin has effectively been running Russia one way or the other since 1999, 2000. He is able to put in place a long-term energy strategy, which he alone is going to be responsible for. If you look at what's going on in China, President Xi is effectively going to be president for life. India, of course, is a different situation as the world's largest democracy, so I wouldn't want to impugn their system. But certainly, all three countries, I think, are seen to be potentially benefiting, whilst those nations, not only the United States, but arguably in Western Europe as well, are seen to be having to sort of walk back their own energy production, for example. And I think that the challenge in the United States is that there is a recognition of the hypocrisy of this, and that it seems that the only people who seem to be reflecting the hypocrisy of this is the Republicans. Very clearly, there is tension within how this policy is put together. But quite frankly, as long as there's a Republican in the White House and a Republican Senate, then the Democrats are going to be able to do very little about this. And if you consider, I think, the long-term goals here of places like Russia and China to establish their own energy independence and their own ability to project force, no doubt, and to be global players to an extent, and to challenge the United States, I think that the perhaps more realist, realpolitik approach adopted by the Republican Party is in stark contrast to the idealism of the Democrats. But you have to suggest that there is very little that's idealistic about what it is that Xi or Putin are trying to do for their respective countries. And I'm sure that they would be quite amused at the what some might see as the naivete of the American idealism exhibited by the likes of Barack Obama and perhaps Joe Biden. This is not a kumbaya moment. This is about realpolitik and American grand strategy. And again, it demonstrates the importance of blending foreign and domestic policy with regard to looking at issues of grand strategy, and how it is that the United States positions itself, not only at home but around the world, with regards to, in this case, energy policy and the ability to try to formulate policy moving beyond a short 8-year period and into the more near-term distance.
Dr. James D. Boys in combative mood there, taking on the perceived flaws in both the Democrat and Republican positions in this election. We are now just 2 shows away from the ultimate showdown, as it were. And so next week you will see us in a similar setting, and then we find ourselves in various negotiations to bring you a live show on the night of the election, should you choose to spend that time with us and indeed stay up into the early hours of the morning. If in the UK, then we would be most honoured to spend said time with you. In the meantime, I'm Michael L. Roberts. You've been listening to The American Chronicle, a 12th Peer production 2020 with music by Chris Warner. Good luck, and ever onward to you all.